feel free to submit your question throughout the presentation through the chat feature. Any relevant links and resources will be shared in the chat window. Thank you for your cooperation and attention. Ladies and gentlemen, sustainability and ESG consideration holds immense global significance in higher education. Universities worldwide recognize the urgency of addressing critical challenges like climate change, social inequality, and technical governance to foster a sustainable future. With the setting up of the ESG Center of Excellence, it aims to be a hub for rigorous, intellectual, open, and in-depth study and discussion in anticipating emerging issues and present ideas in useful, accessible formats to inform and shape public debate. We also should play a role in enhancing the professionalism and effectiveness in ESG professionals and practitioners. Finally, we hope that ESG COE can serve as a beacon for responsible citizenship, innovation, and transformative action that empower future generations to create a better world through sustainable practices and informed decision-making. Therefore, we are having the webinar today to bring together diverse audiences. And I can see that there are also an audience from Washington, D.C. Thank you for joining us today. And I think it's like late night, if I'm not mistaken, in Washington, D.C. now. Fostering collaboration and networking, and most importantly, is for us to interact and exchange ideas with our esteemed speaker of today. With that, I would like to invite our Deputy Vice-Chancellor, Research and Innovation, Professor IR Dr. Kaharudin Dimyati, to deliver his opening remarks. Prof, can you unmute your microphone, Prof? Okay, thank you.
My apology. Thank you very much again, Dr. Zalina. Assalamualaikum, good morning and welcome everyone. And good night. Just now I was made to understand there is also participant from Washington, D.C. Thank you all for joining us today. I hope everyone is doing great and it is not too late to wish Ramadan Kareem for the Muslims in this holy month. I would like to take this opportunity to say thank you as well to Mr. Peter McAteer, the Managing Director for SustainLearning LLC, for being able to be with us today in this session. Ladies and gentlemen, as sustainability becomes increasingly relevant and important in today's world, higher education institutions have played an instrumental role in encouraging and supporting sustainable development agenda and activities, either through education, research, community partnerships, and many more. Universiti Malaya, being the top university in Malaysia, plays an important role in promoting the sustainable development agenda and activities through our education, partnership, research, and innovation in driving the nations towards a sustainably responsible citizens. Beyond our campus, also collaborates with industries, government agencies, and communities for us to work together in amplifying our role to drive the change with positive impacts. We believe that in creating a sustainable future, many changes are required, from the behavior of the leaders and workers to the operations and products we create and use. Therefore, being the platform for education of future generations, we have the responsibility and ability to create and influence change. Hence, our role is crucial in shaping the world. This significant role is particularly pronounced, especially in this region, where rapid urbanizations, environmental degradations, and socio-economic gaps pose unique challenges. Higher education institutions, especially from this region, have a special opportunity to lead by example, championing sustainable practices and empowering future generations to make significant contributions to the communities and the world. Under the UMESG Center of Excellence, which aims to create a national and international connected and globally recognized Center of Excellence for ESG, I hope that it becomes a catalyst and manifesto to our role in delivering our responsibility towards a sustainable nation. With that note, I will pass this role back to Dr. Nur Zalina Mahmud, the head of the Center of Excellence of ESG, to moderate the sessions on ESG as an opportunity, sustainability as an advantage. With that, thank you very much, and back to you, Dr. Zalina.
Thank you very much, Prof, for these enlightening remarks. And thank you for your support on today's webinar. Peter McAteer served as Managing Director for SustainLearning LLC, a firm dedicated to developing more sustainable organization. His focus is on strategy, business transformation, and talent development. He previously served as a Vice President of Organizational Development for Fidelity Investments, CEO of the Corporate University Exchange, or now UNDP, member of the Executive Committee for Harvard Business School Publishing, and Managing Director for its corporate learning business. His earlier roles included serving as Chief Learning Officer and Head of the Global Knowledge Project for the United Nations Development Programme. Peter has served as adjunct faculty in Human Resource Management at Columbia University School of International and Public Affairs and taught workshops at universities around the world, including S8 in Spain and the University of Southern California. His published works have appeared in Directors and Boards, the ATD Journal, the Harvard Business Review, the European Business Forum, and Reuters Business Insight, among others. His most recent books are Sustainability is the New Advantage, Leadership, Change and the Future of Business, and Pathway to Action, How Keystone Organizations and Leaders are the Key to Solving Climate Change, both from Anton Press. Without further ado, we'd like to invite our speaker today, Peter McAteer. Peter, the floor is yours.
Well, thank you very much for that very kind introduction. And let me just see if I can get my slide deck up here without any difficulty. Share my screen. Good sound. Too many pop-ups. Let's see if everyone can see what I've got here. So can you see my slides?
Not yet, Peter.
Okay. Okay.
All right.
So you can see this, you can see it now?
Yes. Yeah, we can see it now.
Okay. My apologies for the delay.
No worries.
Oh, okay. So first of all, thank you all for being here. And what I'm going to talk about is this idea of ESG as an opportunity and sustainability as an advantage. And I like the fact that we have a university involved in this, because I think one of the challenges for everyone is that there's an enormous amount of public policy out there, but people write public policy for a certain kind of audience, which makes what they write fairly generalized. And universities tend to focus on domains and domain depth, whereas corporations tend to look at information around jobs. So there's a need for a little bit of a translation along the way here to get to what I call working knowledge. And the working knowledge is what corporations need, so they can say, related to ESG or related to sustainability, you know, this is what the policy committee at the bank needs to know. This is what the teller at the bank needs to know. This is what the customer service representative needs to know. This is what a loan officer needs to know. And breaking it down that way is essential to sort of make it real for people. So the two books I've put up on the screen, Sustainability is the New Advantage, was really written to help companies get started. You know, how do you do the following things? How do you set a vision? How do you organize teams? How do you scale for action? And Pathways to Action is really about helping organizations who are already involved accelerate action to move faster. And my premise in both of these is that we have a Vision 2030 established by the United Nations with the Sustainable Development Goals. And at the moment in 2024, my perspective would be, although I think it's wonderful to train younger college students, the fact is, if we're going to meet our 2030 goals, it really requires leaders in businesses today to take action, because they're the ones who are in a position to make the kind of changes to transform their organizations. The next generation will lead us from 2030 to 2050. But both of those sort of perspectives, I think, are important as we teach people on this sort of topic. So what I'd like to do today is just get you to think a little bit differently about the challenge of sustainability. Now, a lot of the material I'm going to present, I would generally teach in a day-long or even a two-day-long sort of program. So it's going to be concise and consolidated. And hopefully I just get you to reflect on things as we go through. So I want you to think about the challenge. I want to consider whether ESG is an impossible situation or a real leadership opportunity. I also want you to reflect on your personal accountability for responding to these changes. One of our problems so far is that I don't think people take it seriously enough, even though it is sort of the challenge of our time. But consistent with what I mentioned earlier, which is the idea of working knowledge, I want to explore one of our knowledge or models for taking action, because at the end of the day, it's not enough to talk about it. We have to talk about it in ways that lead to action. So I want to start by getting everyone to sort of think about three numbers. And those three numbers are as follows, and I'll just start at the beginning of the Industrial Revolution and lead up to today. So you can start the Industrial Revolution wherever you want in the very early part of the 19th century, but you have a global population of about 1 billion people, and today you have 8 billion. You had a global GDP, a little over $1 trillion US, and today, according to the International Monetary Fund, we have a global GDP of about 104 trillion. CO2 levels, pre-industrial, is about 275 parts per million. And that varies up and down a little bit over the last 800,000 years, but we'll call that the benchmark. And today, I checked yesterday, and it's a slightly above 420 parts per million. So those numbers basically suggest, why are we in the problem we are now? In part, is this is why we're on the road to a 3-degree increase in average global warming. Because we've increased CO2 levels about 100 parts per million, and that's having a significant impact on global climate. With that, we also have a dual issue of biodiversity. And in there on this chart, I just put some of the goals of the more recent 2030 Montreal Agreement on Biodiversity. Unfortunately, if you look at the data, we have lost since 1970 something like 69% of more than 5,000 species around the world. So aligned with this enormous growth in population and this enormous growth basically in production and consumption has been, because we're a fossil fuel based economy, this enormous growth in atmospheric CO2 and other gases. And the two big impacts are the sustainability issue, which is climate warming and biodiversity. And to me, around that, all the other sustainable development goals are connected. And when we talk about the idea of dual materiality, companies are talking about how do you maintain your financial house, while two, having impact. And when we think of impact, we're thinking of impact on things like sustainability and biodiversity. So those are the real driving numbers as far as I'm concerned. And if I fast forward that and say, well, what's going to happen by the end of this century when my children are my age? Well, we're going to have anywhere from 10 to 12 billion people, depending on which numbers you look at. GDP will probably have more than doubled by then, which means consumption will have doubled by then. And if we're still dependent on fossil fuels, well, where that CO2 level goes is an interesting question. Now, as I mentioned that, and we talk about CO2, I think it's always useful as we consider these issues of ESG to both consider the complexity, because the complexity keeps us honest. It makes it sound like these issues are really not that simple. At the same time, if we're going to take action, we've got to shrink this down into a series of actions that people can do tomorrow. So when we talk about gases, we're also talking about 7 regulated gases. And one of them in particular, I've circled hydrofluorocarbons there, which we don't think about too much. But we've just got a new agreement, the Kigali Agreement, or Kigali Amendment, which is going to regulate hydrofluorocarbons more. And so the key with thinking about ESG is it's not stable. It continues to change because, as we see in these 4 charts, which is carbon dioxide, methane, nitrous oxide, and sulfur hexafluoride, everything's going up. And hydrofluorocarbons, even though they have previously been regulated since 1987, what we're discovering is as we change over from carbon dioxide or methane producing power sources, we are introducing new gases into the atmosphere, which are having unintended effects. So we are playing this sort of game between taking action and then looking at the science and realizing that we're getting a variety of unintended consequences along the way. So to think about ESG, and again, let's think about complexity for a moment. There are more than 250 multilateral environmental agreements from the early 1970s that are still in force today. So I just mentioned Kigali. Now, the Kigali is a subset of the Montreal Protocol, which is itself a subset of the Vienna Convention, all regulating ozone in the atmosphere. So depending on what kind of business you are, it may not just be the Paris Accords that you're worried about or the Kyoto Accords that you might be worried about. There's lots of other sort of things. And this is just on the environment. And remembering that the SDGs cover a much broader range of territory. So there's a lot of complexity, and I don't expect everyone to become an expert on 250. And I have, in fact, offered to different companies to teach them about this, although no one's taken me up on that offer just yet. And this is why we still have to worry and why we should still expect more regulation rather than less. So this chart is the 2100 warming projection. This is done by Climate Action Tracker, and you can just look on their website and find these and other sort of charts. And that top shaded area basically shows where we're going based on current actions and targets. And we're pretty much headed towards a 3 degrees centigrade average change in global temperature over pre-industrial times by 2100, unless we take more action. So there's lots of pledges and there's a lot of optimistic scenarios out there, but fundamentally, we really haven't changed our behavior that much. Now, this, in fact, I think gets people a little bit depressed as they see this. And when I teach, I always like with a different audience to try to make it real for people, because I think one of the problems is I can present these really big pictures and everyone says, Okay, but what am I going to do about it? Well, I looked at a data set for how weather, based on the projections I had on the previous chart, the range of possibilities, how it's going to affect Kuala Lumpur. And on the very lower left-hand side of the chart, I picked someone born in 1960. And I picked that date because I assume pretty much everyone listening has been born 1960 or later, except me. And the idea is over this person's lifetime, and in the middle of the chart, I put age 80 at 2040. And the question is, how much hotter is your hometown going to be at age 80 than it was when you were born in 1960? And again, this is all based on projections of how the weather is changing. And that shaded area is the range of possibilities. And this says how many days in Kuala Lumpur will be at or above 32 degrees centigrade. So the chart really illustrates the range of bad news that's going to come from us doing nothing. Right? In order for us to get that curve to flatten and go the other way, right, we need to take action. We need to take action now. And that means corporations need to take action because they're the ones producing the goods and services around the world that ultimately contribute to these sort of things. So to me, this is a pretty scary number. You may have literally every day in Kuala Lumpur at 32 degrees or above. And when we say above, as the heat moves up this high, above is going to mean some pretty hot days overall. But this sort of thing, when I teach, I like because it really drives it home for people, depending on where you were born, depending on where you are. This is the kind of change that you're going to expect just in your lifetime. Now, the idea of the problem in our lifetime is important because we can go back to the beginning of the Industrial Revolution, but the fact is the largest amount of carbon dioxide in our atmosphere, as well as lots of other issues, whether it's plastic or waste or the degradation of water and air, is really a post-World War II phenomenon. The first century or so, up until 1950, we only had about a 10% increase in atmospheric CO2 to about 310, 315. You can see that in the lower end of the chart here. This is the Keeling curve done by Charles Keeling. Charles has been collecting, started collecting CO2 measurements on a mountain in Hawaii above the cloud level since 1958. Every hour of every day, every week, every month, every year. And you can just see it go straight up. This does not include the gases I have on the right. Impact. Pretty much where there's a lot of these other gases have a half-life that is much shorter and sometimes dissipate in the atmosphere in anywhere from 6 to 20 years. So this is key. Now, I think the really interesting part for people who say there's too much regulation associated with ESG, all you have to do is map onto that line pretty much everything that's happened. And you can map anything you want onto this line. You can map all the great activities that have happened in the publication of all sorts of ESG reports. The fact is, you simply ask yourself the question, has any of these activities as yet had a measurable impact on atmospheric CO2? And we don't have to break this line down too much to say, yes, there's some variation, but it really hasn't had an impact. So we still have a lot of work to do. So again, ESG policy, if you look at it like this, you should expect to see more harmonization, more refinement, more precision, more penalties as you go forward. So even though that sounds like bad news, an operating model for ESG reporting has been slowly emerging. It's from about 1997 when we get the Global Reporting Initiative. And the Global Reporting Initiative becomes the de facto standard for ESG reporting in the early stages. Now, this is, again, is before you even have a definition of sustainability. You don't get your really first good definition until 2000 with the Millennium Development Goals. And of course, we don't get the UN SDGs until 2015. And along the way, we also get lots of other people in different industries, such as the banking and finance industry, creating their own principles for responsible investing. That's a UN-sponsored activity, but it is very industry specific. And along the way, you'll see all sorts of other industries focused on creating something for the textile industry, for the cement industry, for the building and construction trades. So you can layer lots of things on. Along the way here, you're seeing a lot more enhancement this out to this. What does this look like? So this leads us to ESG reporting today. That looks like on the upper left-hand side, global goals and protocols, right? We have the UN SDGs, the UN Global Compact, the United Nations environmental programs, the principles for sustainable insurance. There's also principles for responsible investing. You have the greenhouse gas protocols and the science-based targets, and there's others, but you have basically goals and protocols. On the right-hand side, the upper right-hand side, you now have governments and regions saying, okay, what do we do with this? And that's so you can say, I've got an EU corporate sustainability reporting directive as part of the Green New Deal in Europe. China has its newer climate disclosure regime. The European Union has a whole taxonomy of regulations, so it regulates phrases and language, and that's what gets a lot of people into trouble around greenwashing and things like this. There's also sustainable finance regulations. The US has created new security and exchange disclosure rules. Australia, I could put a whole list up here. So that really comes down to where as a business do you do business? Where do you sell to? And if you sell into some of these markets, then you have to be aware of these regional regulations and guidelines. Within that, a lot of organizations are trying to make sense of these. And so they're creating reporting frameworks. And you have everyone from ISO, the International Organization for Standardization, putting out their ISO 2600 standard for disclosures. You've got a Climate Disclosures Board, Sustainability Accounting Standards Board. You have industry-specific things like the Fashion Industry Charter for Climate Action or the Supplier Data Ethical Exchange. So lots of different sort of reporting frameworks. And for a variety of other things, you now have rating agencies and indices which are trying to compare you versus other companies. Or if, for example, you're trying to buy or sell a carbon credit, well, you need third-party verification of those sort of things. People are not going to take your word for it anymore. And we're trying to break down these ideas. And you can see within here a lot of indexes getting involved in this, like FTSE and Dow Jones and Standard & Poor's, because they want to help investors invest in companies that meet certain sustainability standards. So it is kind of complex, but you can organize this in different ways that are meaningful. So to me, and again, hopefully I was trying to confuse everyone just a little bit. There's a basic question of, is sustainability just another business cost? Or is it the biggest opportunity in history? And I think I tend to lean on the opportunity side, but I think it's incumbent upon me to sort of convince you of that. So I happen to have been at Harvard Business Publishing when we did an article, the Harvard Business Review, after the crash or the financial crisis of 2007. And we reflected on the work of Peter Drucker, and hopefully the people in the audience are not so young that you don't remember who Peter Drucker is, but Peter's often considered the founding father of modern management. And I pulled out two quotes from Peter that I think is helpful, because I think the key here is you've got to change your mental model from responding to policy compliance issues to looking for opportunities. And Peter said that every single social and global issue of our day is an opportunity in disguise. And he also said that entrepreneurs can find significant opportunities to create or transform organizations if they're willing to get ahead of societal changes. So Peter was very much a big proponent of being an early adopter in some of these instances. And I think that's a useful framework as we think of this idea of dual materiality, right? Of not only creating financial outcomes for our business, but having impact on social and environmental value creation. So if I examine the leadership opportunities out there, and in this chart, I've listed the top 5 emission sectors and their percentage of global emissions, and you can find these numbers are slightly different. It's not that there's inaccuracy in most of these numbers, it's just that what they include in agriculture is a little bit different in some instances than others. But these are the approximate percentages. And in each of these instances, you can break this down more. So you can say within construction, let me just look at cement and concrete production, which by itself is 7 to 8% of the global emissions total. And in aggregate, in order to reach 2050 net zero targets, we have to invest about another $30 trillion by 2030 globally to to meet our targets and stay within the 1.5 to 2 degree centigrade global warming tradition. This does not include our impact on biodiversity, since those biodiversity goals came sort of after this, and the net zero goals really only focus on climate change. But there's a huge amount of opportunity, and there's a lot of money being invested all over the world. And to me, that's the goal. So to me, this means innovation. And I always find it's useful when I speak with organizations to talk about innovation in a way that's really optimistic. Innovation is a forward-looking, optimistic activity. Framework of how we create a better society for tomorrow. And the challenges, turbulence, and ambiguity are the source of opportunities, right? They are not the barriers to doing business. So within that, I want to simplify now, right? So we go from big and complex to let's simplify down. So I want us to focus for a moment on SDG goals 13, 14, and 15, which is climate action, life underwater, and life on land. And regardless of the opportunity you pursue, I think there are 4 boundary conditions which govern your business. The first is discovering competitive differentiation in sustainability, right? If you look at ESG as a compliance activities by definition, everybody does the same thing. If everybody does the same thing, you do not have a competitively differentiated organization. So you've got to find ways to make your business better than everybody else. You've got to be thinking about creating recurring multi-capital value. You know, a lot of businesses think of 4 capitals, some are focused on 6 capitals, some even break it down to 8 capitals. But it's the idea of thinking of not only financial capital, but things like natural capital, right? And how do I value that, which is something we've not quite been used to. The third area is avoiding social and environmental negatives, right? So we cannot make the situation any worse than it is now. And fourth, we've got to help regenerate natural systems as part of business, because again, we're going to increase the population of the planet Earth. We are going to increase global GDP. We're going to do all these things, and somehow we've got to start repairing the things that we have damaged. So to me, those are the new boundary conditions as you think about strategy. And to do that, I put out a little map here of how do you get from compliance, which is stage 1, to a more strategic focus on sustainability. And I can break this model out more broadly with additional steps, but I think, again, responsible, becoming strategic with respect. The right side of the model is essentially your legacy organization, right? It's where you are now. And so your legacy organization, unless you're a brand new startup focused on sustainability, your legacy organization is likely to be an organization driven by fossil fuels, and that you have a certain waste and water profile for your business that is essentially not sustainable long-term given the growth projections. The left side of the model is looking at value a different way. And the question is, how do I get from A to B? And the challenge always for organizations, and even if I wasn't thinking about sustainability, is how do I move from the revenue model, which supports where I was? So you can look back at the research on disruptive innovation and say, I'm a mainframe computer or mid-range computer company, and I can see that the market says I've got to move to personal computers, but all my revenue is tied up in my legacy model. And the tendency is to wait too long, to move too slow, and those companies disappear. And there's lots of examples in that in the research literature. I don't have time to go into all that today, but you could easily spend a half hour just talking about that, where this pattern we have seen before. The question is, how do you break down the old mental models, the old barriers, and evolve from a legacy organization to a sustainable business? So where people get into a lot of problems is they try to jump from being a cook to being a 3-star Michelin chef. And they start making commitments and messaging that just doesn't work. And that's what you see in the marketplace, which is often called greenwashing or green lighting or green bleaching or green gaslighting. Or if you're a little bit creative, you change the word green to blue. They make it blue washing, which at the moment tends to refer more to financial service firms and what they're doing. But companies like to overpromise. And what they're finding is with increased regulation, that can have significant lack of talent, which 3 to 4. So I throw that out because there are consequences for trying to short circuit the process. So again, if I expand this just a little bit, your stage 1 is really about avoiding risks, in part because there's such complexity in the ESG environment, you're still trying to figure it out. And I liken this to a very low maturity knowledge environment. And my example of low maturity knowledge environment would be, is if I got 4 CFOs in a room and said, we're all going to sit down and look through a balance sheet. Everyone would open their books or open their tablets and start looking at the balance sheet. I wouldn't have to explain anything because everyone knows exactly what a balance sheet is. If I bring 4 human resource professionals into a room and say, we're going to talk about emerging leaders. Well, the first thing we have to talk about is, well, what do you mean by emerging leader? I've got to start getting definitions in place. Or maybe we don't like to do that in our organization, or we call it something different. But I have to have a conversation first. And the same thing is true today with chief sustainability officers or others. When I start talking about things about your sustainability strategy, you've got to say, well, what does that mean? Because there's so much potential there. But the journey is always from legacy value, right, to becoming more efficient, which is what everybody does, right? They're trying to reduce negative impacts. And in that, you're doing experiments. And the challenge with experiments is you're never sure whether that experiment is scalable, right? So I call that perceived value because it looks good on the experiment. The question is, can I scale that in a way where it substitutes for some of the legacy revenue that I've been doing so I can reduce that and still grow as an overall business on my way to creating totally new solutions and new value as part of my strategic direction. And those middle 2 stages are really where it's hard. There have been companies like a Unilever who started their sustainable product portfolio close to 15 years ago. They still have a lot of legacy products. So it's a long journey for some companies. Their advantage is they started early. If you're starting 15 years after them, my suggestion is you're going to have to move a little faster. Now, here's an example of a company. You're in compliance. It's a transportation company. You can go out to the Sustainability Accounting Standards Board, plug into your industry, et cetera. It'll tell you, here's a bunch of categories. And then I overlaid a little bit some of the SDGs. The SDGs don't naturally fit all these categories because, as I mentioned earlier, they're developed by policymakers trying to do something. You've got 193 countries and 198 total parties who are signing on to this who have to come to an agreement. If you've ever tried to get 198 people, never mind 193 countries and 198 total parties, to agree on what you have for lunch, you know how difficult that is. So these don't align perfectly, so you have to do a little bit of work. But you can get to this point, to the basic compliance report with the Global Reporting Initiative, with the SASB, with the ISO conditions, fairly easily, even though there's still a lot of work within here to describe things. So ESG as compliance in stage 1 is all about legacy value and just describing where you are. And that is fairly easy today because of harmonization efforts. I really find very few people get themselves really into trouble there because they make a good faith effort to respond to that. And if you want to be a member of the UN Global Compact, for an example, the UN has made it very easy. There's a survey, standard questions, just answer the questions. There's a letter that your CEO has to sign. That's now online, a form letter. So they've made it as easy as humanly possible. The key issue is not the compliance part of it. Okay, I did the survey, I sent you the letter. The issue is taking those 4 underlying international agreements that deal with things like human rights and say, how does that apply to my business? And if you're going to do that, that requires having a conversation. So within the business, you've got to be asking, how can new business models lead to competitive advantage? And what levers of control, and by levers of control, I mean, at different levels of the organization, what are the things you would do to accelerate action towards your strategic aspiration. And what this chart says, there are certain of these models on the lower scale, which have a certain level of effort or investment. I've done it from low to high. And on the left-hand side, the vertical axis, there's a level of operational engagement. How many people need to be involved, from general to specific? So in the lower left, you'll see in the press all sorts of ideas, which are more philosophies: conscious capitalism, green capitalism, clean capital. On the right-hand side, there are things that are also fairly general in terms of concepts. But if you're going to decarbonize as a business, that requires a lot more investment and effort, or to decouple growth, meaning I'm going to continue to have my growth curve going up while my carbonization output is going down. Those require a lot more effort. The upper left-hand side are specific things, but they don't require necessarily involvement from everyone in the organization. So an offset strategy, again, through my compliance efforts, I know how much my carbon footprint is, and I buy a carbon offset. That may only involve the people in finance or the senior leaders to sign off on buying that. So again, it's a very specific sort of activity with a low level of overall organizational effort. In the upper right-hand side are things like regenerative economics and nature-based solutions, circular economy models, and there's a whole bunch of other ones up there, which take a lot of creative thinking. At the moment, are very aspirational. You can't really do all these 100%, but there is a very evolving, solid body of research and company experience in that area, which is expanding. And so to really try to do that requires you to totally rethink all your products and services. So the level of investment, the level of effort is very significant. But again, the important thing is, as you're doing compliance, to start the conversation in your business. Now, within the conversation, of course, you've got to identify opportunities. So it's not enough to say, I want to be circular economy someday. So the things I try to do with organizations, I say, you typically would look at the left-hand scale, at the scale of any resource commitment, and the right-hand scale, the level of risk, and the upper scale, the complexity of change. What's really changed is the idea of dual materiality on the bottom, which I'm not just looking at financial benefit, right? But I'm looking at social and environmental impact. And to get going, you need to have a point of entry, right? Where are we today and what can we do? While also having what many companies call their North Star, right? Where am I going? It may be an aspiration point. I may never get there, but it encompasses the idea of business transformation. And within there is your zone of opportunity that you have to create a messaging strategy to communicate to your organization, to the communities where you live and work, to your investors, to other interested people, that says, this is where we're trying to go, and this is where we're starting off today. Now, I know I'm working through this fast, and again, I don't expect, that's one of the reasons I wrote a book about it, but your ESG behavior, even though I said there are policies, sector standards, and topical standards, a grayish area in between that you can go to the SASB or GRI to do, your strategy has a much bigger influence on ESG behavior because it determines the kinds of products you're going to work on, how you differentiate them, and whether that differentiation stays within the boundary conditions that are evolving over time. And on the lower level, your ESG behavior is also defined by your legal status, right? The kind of company you are, in part, will determine the kind of reporting you have to do, as will your exchange listing. So different exchanges around the world, they're not totally different, but there are some small differences. The size of your organization. In many parts of the world, a small to medium-sized organization is dealt with differently than a large organization. Or if you are, for example, a company like a Johnson & Johnson, and you have 270 different business units operating in 64 different countries, well, your ESG behavior is going to look quite different. Then, of course, there's voluntary memberships. If you do, as I mentioned earlier, join the UN Global Compact, that obligates you not just to the 17 SDGs, but the 4 other intergovernmental multilateral agreements that are part of that. And then finally, you have your customers and markets. And your customers and markets say, again, if I'm going to sell into China, I have to comply with Chinese rules and regulations. If I go to the European Union, I have to comply with those rules and regulations, to the United States, et cetera. And we discovered during the pandemic, when there were some businesses in Malaysia that suffered some very unfortunate consequences in the US market through the sale of PPE products, where they were banned because they did not comply with, again, the market expectations in the United States. And then finally, again, because there are new rules and regulations that can be predicted, there's the question of how are you future-proofing your organization? So are you thinking about the new international law of the seas, which has come out, or the new proposed treaty on plastic pollution? All of those things are going to affect your reporting, as are new standards in the EU or the US, et cetera. So as you think of ESG behavior, even though your compliance level, you can get to a standard, the real issue is, depending on the kind of organization, you should look different as you evolve. So in doing that, what I've laid over this model now is an evolution also of your business strategy, of moving maybe from an offset model to a net benefit model, to a shared value creation model, to a circular economy model. And along the way, each of those different business strategies will imply different kinds of work within your organization, specifically to your finance department or to your supply chain department, et cetera. But these are choices that you make as you go through. And again, as you move from compliance to efficiency, again, there's difference in how you do. So I've layered over here, you might move from ESG compliance, just using GRI and SASB. And now as you move into the efficiency stage and you're into a net benefit, which means you're trying to offset your negatives with positives, is I may be looking at competitive practices. What are all my other competitors doing in this? I want to be as good as them. As I move around the model, I may be looking at best practice. I want to lead the market because my branding strategy says that's what I want to do. And as I move to the top of the model here, ESG for strategic impact, I'm really looking at very much integrated reporting. And when you look at ESG reporting for companies who are really up in this stage, you find often the reference to ESG is on page 64 of their report. The rest, everything is embedded in how they talk about revenue generation and how they talk about profitability, how they talk about new markets and things. They're not separating it as much. They're embedding it in everything they do. So there is a path to map your sustainability journey to your compliance reporting to your business strategy. Now, again, I don't have the time to go into everything, but every one of these 4 stages, there tends to be typical things that people do. So if you're stage 2, you're in that efficiency. These are the 8 that everybody does. Energy efficiency, waste reduction, water efficiency, material efficiency, packaging and optimization, transport efficiency, recycling, reuse, and remanufacturing. That's 99% of what people do at stage 2. And the reason people do these 8 things is because they work very, very well with existing capabilities. They also allow you to do a short-term ROI because they generate cost savings. I can reduce my energy efficiency and say, look, I saved 10%. No one argues with that, right? It's also very useful for building enthusiasm. It's an opportunity for staff development. And most importantly, it's an opportunity for new social and political capital. So what that means is that the real value here is how can it help you get from stage 2 to stage 3? If you use these as end results, then you're going to run into a period of diminishing returns. You can only reduce energy efficiency by so much every year if you're still using the same energy sources, right? So at some point you're going to stop. So the key to me is, how do I use gains here to create the social and political capital to take more risk in the organization? And that, again, is a more nuanced approach. So as I do this, I now can start layering over this the kinds of things I might do from an innovation perspective, right? So in black, as I put on the right side here, I'm doing incremental innovation, right? The same thing, I'm doing experimentation as I get into the efficiency stage. I might be doing reverse engineering after that. I might even now be moving into more disruptive innovation because I've gained confidence that a new product and service I have is capable of really upsetting the market. And when I move above that, I'm really focused on how do I scale at speed. And that's the challenge for me as I get to the stage 4 in this sort of model. But all of these, again, you can make this, there's a lot more complexity. My goal here is not to confuse you, but to simply say every one of these things has another level. Again, here's another level. So as I think of innovation, as I mentioned earlier, it's not about domain knowledge, it's about making it real for every role. So as I start looking at, well, who can introduce a green bond? Well, in a bank, my customer service representative and my teller can't do green bonds. That's an executive role. That may be a risk committee role. That may be the finance role. If I want people at the front end of this, I've got to teach them innovation practices that relate to process innovation and performance innovation or network innovation or communications innovation. And conversely, if I'm up in marketing, I've got to start thinking about brand innovation and channel innovation and product system innovation or customer experience innovation. Different skills for different groups within the organization. So it requires a lot of differentiated training to go on. So I've put one more layer over the top here, and I'll start wrapping up and give people an opportunity to ask questions if they like. So as you look on the top right, where you're in a compliance mode, this is really the area where only a few key staff need to be actively involved, because you haven't shared yet with the rest of the organization a real transition. You move down in the efficiency stage, we're trying to ideate and you're trying to experiment and you start moving into partnerships. You're developing core teams, right? So you're trying to develop those people who have the potential in your organization to learn from these things and scale. You do partnerships when you're trying to manage a risk, when you're trying to learn something new. And in fact, my second book, Pathways to Action, Partnerships is a key part of it. And I present a wheel of 8 different types of value creation and partnerships. Again, the key is to understand why are you doing this, and therefore you structure your partnership accordingly. Beyond that, now as you're getting into becoming more responsible, you're starting to worry about how do I take the knowledge from those partnerships and scale, right? Because that's what I'm doing. I've now figured out, using the example I said earlier about Unilever, in recent annual reports, Unilever is reporting that their sustainable product portfolio is growing substantially faster than their legacy product portfolio and generates higher profit margins. So it doesn't take a real business genius to say, well, that's great. How do we scale those faster? If they generate more revenue, if people like them and they're willing to pay a higher premium, I want to scale that. Now, do I have the talent in the organization, as well as the processes and the incentives and all the other levers of control, which is what senior executives need to do, to drive that forward as fast as possible? And as I get into the circular economy model, I've developed a new strategic, sustainable value model, and I want to exploit that as much as possible in the marketplace, because hopefully I've got serious competitive advantage, and I need talent and depth at that point, because I have to accommodate for growth as opposed to experimentation. So that's how the model works its way around. There's a lot of different pieces of moving in that. And in that, I often like to add to someone, as they begin to think of all that talent development, to think of talent a little bit differently. And this is the idea where we get this dual materiality, which for the most part, we only look at in the context of reporting. But I think we need to think of it in terms of the mental models of the people in our organization. So I created something called the C profile, and this is in my second book, Pathways to Action, where the vertical profile is your core capabilities. So there's nothing about sustainability that says we're not going to have an engineering function or an HR function or a marketing or finance function. We're going to have those, and people are still going to be trained in those, and they're going to go to universities for things. But those core capabilities are evolving over time, right? And with that, if you're going to take action, again, go back to look at what I said about the organization, right? You've got to have a strategy. You've got to have all these compliance activities. You got to worry about your customers, your markets, your voluntary memberships, the exchange you're listed on if you're publicly traded, the kind of organization you are, et cetera. So I've got to have some climate competencies in here that are specialized knowledge that relate to those new boundary conditions I mentioned earlier. And because this is a low maturity knowledge domain, collaboration is much more important. One of the key parts you see in almost all successful best practice sustainable organizations today is they do much more collaborative work on problem solving and decision making, because you need different perspectives to help you out of your old mental model. And it's one of the reasons also I teach the mutual gains approach to negotiation, because I think that idea of building collaborative negotiated agreements that have a long-term value creation is very, very important. So everyone needs to have a C profile. They need to have a home in a core capability. They need to have enhanced collaborative credibilities, depending on who they are, right? Negotiating skills, communication skills, teaching skills if you're a leader, leading from behind, how to encourage innovation. And you have to have a sense of climate competencies in order to operate in this new business environment. So I just want to wrap up now, and I've left out a lot of things in this sort of conversation so far. And I think one of the real important takeaways that I think is very important is this idea of working knowledge. Because given all that complexity out there, trying to find one person who knows everything and just have them tell the organization is really not a successful strategy. That's a very early market sort of innovation strategy. I rely on that. All markets evolve over time. And if you look at technology, right, we used to rely on MIS managers, we evolved them into chief information officers, and then we said, well, wait a minute, I need to have a separate chief product officer because I need someone worried about that, and maybe a chief technology officer, and now a chief digital officer. So it's logical that things evolve over time based on what we know. But the key is, how do I drill my strategy down so that everyone in the organization can participate and that they know what they need to do tomorrow differently based on this idea of a sustainable business? The organization also needs to begin to think about techniques for accelerating action. Because if you thought of a really good idea that's going to be good in the marketplace, moving slow does not help you gain competitive advantage. And that requires you to create this culture of innovation. And that's where you unlock the wisdom of teams, where everyone is able to do more and more and more and contribute ideas. But the leadership team has to be able to deal with all these new ideas so that they don't die on the vine. And that requires some new talent development strategies. And separate from that is sort of a business intelligence effort, future-proofing it. All good future-proofing starts with good governance, right? And good governance requires this conversation, not at the end of the year, all through the year. So you can be asking yourself, am I going to have to worry about, for example, PESG, where the P stands for products? Am I prepared for TNFD, which is all the new biodiversity data that's out there? Will AI revolutionize reporting? And if I don't understand the basics, and if I depend on AI, well, I just have a bunch of garbage being sent out there that I can't really explain. So there's a lot of implications to all this future-proofing ideas. And if you think about something like TNFD, that doesn't sound too complicated. Well, here's an example of the Task Force on Nature-Related Financial Disclosures. All sorts of new kind of categories of information, new reporting that will ultimately grow out of this. The good news is they've taken a page from the TCFD and they're harmonizing the structure of that. And again, they're harmonizing with SASB and GRI as we're currently thinking of those. However, it does say we are not paying enough attention to the natural continue, and we've got to stop doing that. So, is there complexity? Absolutely. Can it seem overwhelming at times? Absolutely. However, is there opportunity in this? I go back to what Peter Drucker said, that every single social and global issue of our day is an opportunity in disguise. It may not be obvious. If it was, it would be easy, and business is not easy. It requires you to do some serious thinking. It requires you to really take advantage of things like partnerships, to rethink your ecosystem differently, to even rethink your organizational structure, which may have grown up based on financial regulations, tax advantages, different sort of things. Is it now working within this new sort of model? And with that, I'm going to leave a little bit of time for any questions if anyone has it. And I do thank you for listening to all of this. And let me see if I can drop out of that and come back. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Peter. I think this is a very overwhelming insights from you. And I see that there's a lot of components in ESG and sustainability has been, discussed and mentioned. And I'm very interested when you say that how to make tomorrow differently. So I think this is how, you know, we look into, when you mentioned before, we have this small discussion before we had our webinar today, you're talking about this changing mental model and that kind of thing. So actually, even for me myself, when we talked about that yesterday, so it was like, say, what is this changing mental model, you know? So I can see today there's a lot that I learned from your presentation, and I believe our audience also do that also. And to make things more interesting today, we are opening the session for Q&A. Anybody can, you can just post your question through the chat box. We have one now, Peter.
Yes.
If I can read to you.
Yes,
now.
please.
Okay, Peter, listed corporations in Malaysia are fully aware of ESG and its benefit as part of the compliance requirement by the regulators. Despite making profit, decision makers are keen to invest for financial gains to create value for stakeholders and long-term market, but reluctant to invest in sustainability initiative due to low ROI with perceived benefit. How would you convince the C-suites to be champion in sustainability? The question is from Azlan Shah.
Yeah, it's a very common question and a very good one. And people in Malaysia are not the only people thinking this way. All organizations have structures, and if you sit on a board of directors, you know, you talk constantly about financial performance, revenue, existing products, profitability, et cetera. If you talk about ESG, it's generally on one of the quarterly meeting agendas as a subset. And because there's low maturity in us understanding value creation in some areas, there's a reluctance. I just don't know how it's going to be, which is why, as I get to stage 2, I say what you need to do is start doing experiments, right? And with the experiments, you need to really ramp up all the other 8 things. And in doing those 8 things, you have to use those to help convince people that taking a little bit of risk is important. Having simultaneously a future-proofing conversation, which says, I'm part of, for example, in Malaysia, part of an auto industry supply chain, or I'm in part of a aerospace supply chain. Well, I need to look at that, see where the industry is going, see where the major players are going, and say, all right, do I see business risk in the next few years? If yes, is it worth investing a certain amount of money to experiment to see if I have an appropriate response to that? Even if I don't know yet whether I will be required to do that, is it worth the money? And it's a risk reduction. And organizations are very good at risk reduction conversations. That's a standard kind of conversation. But again, I think, you know, there's a reason why most companies are not early adopters. They always like to wait a little bit more. The question is, do you have the capacity to be a fast follower? It's just a reasonable question. And in a fast changing market, I think that's a reasonable thing for business to do. So what would I do? I would invest in experimentation. You don't necessarily have to invest a lot. I would potentially partner with other organizations. So I reduce the amount of investment so I can learn more. I would do future proofing to see where my potential future risk is. And maybe I've underrepresented that. You can be an insurance company in Malaysia and say, well, we haven't had extreme weather events like they have had in Europe or the United States. And I could say, I don't know, give it time. But you know, global weather patterns are changing. And even if it has not affected you yet, there may be $1 billion risk event in your future. So the question is, would that cause you to change the way you do your underwriting? Would it cause the way you change some of the things you do? Would it cause you to change some of your product portfolio in doing it? And the logic is, I probably would take my insurance placements and spread it more around to spread my risk. And I'll sacrifice 2 or 3 points in margin today with the potential of avoiding a catastrophic loss tomorrow. So those to me are very, very standard business conversations, and that's the way I generally do it. But if I do that, I often say to people, if I can show you a way to make money over the next year or two, becoming more sustainable, will you listen to me as we discuss how to transform your business? I did this recently with a company in India, a creative agency, and they said, we love the idea of sustainability, but my customers don't want to give me contracts for more sustainable messaging. I said, okay. And as I said before, I will meet you where you are, which is my point of entry. But I got to convince you that your direction needs to be modified. Maybe the timeline is longer, maybe the path is a little longer, but I need to get you to embrace that concept. If you do, okay, my job for today is done. Now I work on tomorrow, and we keep going. So hopefully I've given some answer to the question.
Okay, I hope so, Azlan, that answers your question. And in fact, he adds a little bit line here when he says that what are the strategies that can be implemented to cultivate simpler mindset among the audience regarding sustainability?
I find that if you're going to have a conversation about anything, all right, you have to raise the level of maturity of the audience. All right. So if I talk to my 18-year-old son in the other room who likes to sleep till 2 o'clock in the afternoon, I have to frame my conversation at a different level. But as I increase the maturity in the audience, so to me, I go into organizations, you need to start the conversation at the foundation level. Right? Get everybody to start thinking differently, get everybody to begin to personalize this, which is why I use that chart about how hot is your hometown going to be. Right? That hits home for people. You can do the same thing with students, have them collect news articles. You can do, there's a dozen different ways. Personalize it, personalize it, personalize it. Unlike re-engineering or right-sizing or Kaizen or Six Sigma or anything else, if I do Six Sigma at business, I go home, I don't have to do Six Sigma at home. I leave it at work, all right? I can have a nice sloppy house and do anything I want and do Six Sigma at work. Climate change also means I've got to change personal behavior, right? It's different than any other challenge we've ever had in our lifetime. So again, you've got to personalize it. You've got to do a lot of training. You've got to personalize it.
Okay, we can start together, Azlan, on this. Okay, next question from Shan. Hi, Peter, great sharing. Please share an example case of organization that have achieved success through the sustainability journey of 4 stages.
I think, sorry, was someone else? Okay, success stories. Success stories are hard to find because most companies are still on the journey. So in my book, I highlight a company like Ayala Corporation in the Philippines, who I've interviewed extensively. But I think they have a dozen different business units. And some of the business units are not wholly owned. Some of them are minority owned. So you're going to expect a different kind of pathway in each of those businesses. Some of those are highly carbon intensive businesses. So the transition is slower there. So it's easy to say, oh, look at Tesla or something like that. Well, that's not a good example because they started out as an EV company and all of the controlling shares in the business are owned by Elon Musk and his brother. All right, so he can't even be fired. So that's not a good example of a transition strategy. A good example of a transition strategy is more like a Unilever who has been struggling with it because that's reality, because we really don't have all the solutions yet. So that to me is, you know, we are still a long way on this journey and we are going to be evolving. So anyone who has success today is still going to have to change because how we define success today is not the way we'll define it in 2030, 2040, 2050. There are a few other examples I put in my book, but on the off chance that my talk today encourages people to buy my book, I'll say, read it in my book. There's at least a dozen examples in each that will highlight what I think. And I do try to illustrate, and I use the Ayala example in my book. I do a much longer case example there, because to me, if you really want to learn from this on people who have been on this journey for 10 years, go back and look at their published reports from 10 years ago. and 7 years ago, and leave a couple of years in between and see how their reporting has evolved over time. And then the key to me when I do my interviews is when you talk to people and say, what is the tone of the conversation as you have sat in on these meetings over 10 years? And that's really when you get people to say to you, it's night and day. We didn't know what we didn't know, right? And it was the process of having the conversation that really opened our eyes. So anyway, I may not have given you as many examples, and I may have done a gratuitous marketing for my book, but nevertheless, that's where I'm going to stand on that question.
Yeah. Okay, thank you. The process is more important on how you see, look back into the 10 years and then the current, and also look into how it facilitates the future, right? Okay, next question is from Ng Kok Tong. Hi, Peter. Can I have your view on how CBAM is going to affect the Malaysian market?
That's a slightly more complex question. And I'm just looking at my watch here. I'm not quite sure I have the time to go into that. But for every change, okay, these days, there is an archival model behind it. These days, no one drafts, these new models out of whole cloth. Everyone is building on models that I illuminated a little bit in that timeline. So with that, I would encourage people to look at executive summaries and things, right? All of these models, and I'll use an example of something different, of an IPCC report, right? You can read the executive report, which is for policymakers and is short because they don't think policymakers will read more than 20 pages. Say, okay, but there's 3 substantive reports beyond that in aggregate might be 1,000 pages. And then there's specialized reports, which derive off of that, which might be another 1,000 pages, right? And then if I want to, I can then look out at all the rating companies and auditing companies. So you can say, I'm going to go look at what Deloitte is saying, because Deloitte believes it's in their business to offer advice to you on this. And you can start going out and finding, and to me, the best way to look at this is to get multiple perspectives. Look at the policy discussion, look at how the marketplace is responding to it, right? Both in Malaysia and other people trying to sell into Malaysia, leading companies, lagging companies, and somewhere in between all of those, you're going to see what's going on. And I also like to look at the objections, because very often by the time you get to a set of regulations, and I don't know this specifically, I can't say this specifically about Malaysia, but I can, for example, I know on GRI reporting, I sit on a committee. So I see all the new mining regulation during its 3 periods of public comment. And you can see it move from this slowly shrinking down as they reach consensus. But it doesn't mean that those things that were left on the table aren't going to reappear later. It just means we can't reach consensus at it now. So I find this issue of future proofing, right, often is interesting and is worth my time going back and looking at all those things. So I have specifically not answered your question and taken 5 minutes of my available 10 minutes left, which means I can't really answer it in full. But I encourage you to follow the process I suggest, because the real answer is it's undetermined, right? Because lots of different things have unintended consequences. But the answer still is the same. Where is your competitive advantage? And what do you have to do to remain in compliance? Do the compliance stuff as fast as possible, right? Because you don't want to be in trouble. But the rest is say, where are my opportunities?
All right, thank you, Peter. Yeah, thank you very much. So, okay, the next question is from Dr. Zida, because we have another 8 minutes left. Hi, Peter. I'm currently heading the campus sustainability effort in my campus, which is Universiti Malaya. And one of the tasks is to build sustainability competencies in our new graduates, so they will ready to deal with sustainability challenges when they join the workforce. Any thought on how to do this effectively across different disciplines? Can you share any good practices in higher education in dealing with the challenges?
Well, I think you have a couple of challenges. Universities around the world, most of them have not moved their curriculum substantially. So if you're going for an MBA degree, a lot of what you're going to get in your MBA degree looks a lot like what you were going to get in your MBA degree 10 years ago, 20 years ago, kind of thing. There's only a few universities. We've had at least one in Malaysia migrate their curriculum. It was a Sunway University, I believe, with Jeffrey Sachs' involvement, to say we're focused exclusively on sustainability. You have a few others around the world doing that. They tend to be the exceptions to the rule at the moment. But in general, I believe action learning is it. When I started this pathway, I was at the United Nations and I was asked to teach at Columbia. And when I was at Columbia, I just asked someone one day, could we take everybody in the master's program who's involved in their senior or their final project, and can you give them to me? And I want them to research around the world. And I divided the world into 5 areas. And I wanted them to research thought leaders, practice leaders, events. When people got together, what are they talking about? Investment dollars, where was the smart money going? And awards. When people were being celebrated, what are they being celebrated for? But I didn't want just one group. I wanted from 5 regions of the world. Otherwise, I'd get everybody from the United States and Europe. So I said, no, you've got to look at those in Africa. You've got to look at those in Asia. You've got to look at this. And then separately, I organized around 5 sustainability domains. So I want to know with sustainable energy in Africa, when they get together for meetings, what are they talking about? And, but I asked everyone in the graduate class, you have to vote on this. You're either all in or you're all out. And I got a unanimous yes. They all worked on it. We created something called the Top 5 Project, which I creatively did because there were 5 regions of the world and 5 domains and 5 areas of information. That was my major contribution to the project. But to me, everyone loved it. I'll give you another example. I did a project called the Ulysses Project at the United Nations, worked with a bunch of big consulting firms where they would send me students, they're up and coming people, to work in middle-income countries on sustainability projects. Everybody loved it. Cost a lot of money because you had to go and relocate people for 6 weeks. I got a call on the phone from one of the heads saying they're going to drop out. And I said, oh, why? I said, did they not enjoy the program? Said, no, loved the program. I said, oh, is it too expensive? No, we thought it was a good investment at the time. I said, well, I'm confused. Why would you drop a program that everyone loves, that you think there's it was reasonably expensive? He said, because every one of the people left our organization because they wanted to have more meaningful work. And I said, oh, I can't feel bad about that. So I do think giving people good action learning projects is the key, because you want to turn them into sustainability warriors to go forth. Whatever they learn in school is going to be irrelevant in 10 or 15 years anyway, just like computer science and many other things. So you really want to give them the foundation. You want to give them the critical thinking skills, and action learning projects is the way to generate enthusiasm and ownership.
Okay, thank you, Peter. I think because Dr. Zida and also her team has been doing a tremendous and excellent job actually in trying to put everybody together in the sustainability journey for the university actually. Okay, we have another 4 questions actually, but okay, we have only like 4 minutes, so probably you have to answer only 1 minute for each question. Or if Azlan, you don't mind, we give way to the others who have not asked question yet. Azlan, if the time does not permit us. Okay, the question is, dear Peter, of the various ESG reporting framework, guidelines and indices available at the moment to cooperation, which of these do you find to be most effective, directed and sincere towards ESG in business?
My brain is not oriented to short answers, but I will try.
Okay.
The simple answer is stage 1, GRI, SASB. Okay, those are the most straightforward answers. But again, they don't get you competitive advantage. They get you basic reporting. Right? They are the most harmonized. And most people are good at finance reporting, and a lot of people ask the finance manager to do it. So going to the Sustainability Accounting Standards Board. But again, that's all a single materiality focus. All right. New regulations in the EU, for example, are mandating a dual materiality focus. So if you have business in the EU, then my answer needs to be adapted. And you've got to throw in all the recommendations from the task force on climate-related financial disclosures, right? Which was voluntary, started in 2017, will become mandatory for most people, is mandatory in certain markets. Anyway, that's my 60 seconds. Next question.
All right, next question from Prof. VGR Chandran. Hi, Peter. Do you think that there is too much hype on finance? But in reality, what firms want is the knowledge and know-how, how to do it. Our own case studies show this. What is your opinion on this?
There's an emphasis on finance because that's where people's comfort zone is. Again, we've had 170 years or so of working through financial models, reporting, and everything else. And we've had about 8 years really working collectively on ESG reporting. The early ESG reporting from the 1990s is almost irrelevant because you didn't even have the SDGs until 2015, and the SASB wasn't created until 2011. So it's really this very recent focus on things like dual materiality and reporting, whereas financial reporting, we know. Right? I work a lot with a bunch of small investment firms who are appealing to investors. And I'll guarantee you, the investors still turn to the back page of the pro forma to see what the ROI is. And so even though the front half can have all sorts of ideas about sustainability and climate change and solutions, they still look to the back at how much money am I going to make? So that mental model changes slowly and is going to evolve over time. So I agree, but be the advocate who stands up in the room and champions the alternative to keep the group honest. Next question.
Okay, thank you. Okay, this will be the last question. Sorry, Azlan, because due to time, I think we have only a few seconds left. Okay, from Muhammad Daniel. Hi, Peter. I imagine in the future, regulation in ESG may also require SME to produce their own ESG report. SME faces some constraint in terms of funding and manpower and may not be able to prepare like listed operation. So how would SME can be prepared for the future ESG regulations?
Yeah, it's a good question. And I think the issue with small to medium-sized enterprises. So in my first book, I have an entire chapter devoted to the idea that small businesses have to do this differently, right? And for the very reason, no small to medium-sized business has their own chief sustainability officer, right? It doesn't work that way. Small businesses tend to have generalized skills, where large businesses can afford to work onto specialized skills. So this is where industry associations, government policy make a difference. If you're a small business and you're told that I need to give you scope 3 emissions on the chemicals I use in my coatings on a piece of metal, your answer at your work has got to be, you've got to be kidding me. How the heck am I going to do that? Yet there are companies like a BASF who have created large databases now that offer you a proxy for that. So you wind up now having to say, taking industry associations for chemicals and things, recognizing the importance of this, making some of this information public disclosure. So I can go find an industry standard database. So you're going to find, I think, going forward, artificial intelligence is going to play a really big role in this, in making new kinds of data available, because otherwise you will constrain innovation in small to medium-sized enterprises. And you will force them into mergers and things to get bigger when it's not driven by the real need of innovation. It's generated by regulatory requirements. And you have had a bunch of pushback, particularly on scope 3 regulations. So my guess would be you're going to see a lot of regulations with future dates. So they're going to be saying, hey, SME, you don't have to do it today, but 2027, 2028, 2029, it's coming. And along the way, maybe you'll do a lot of screaming and yelling and smashing your feet and pounding the table, and they'll change 2029 to 2030. But eventually it's going to happen. And bigger businesses, so let's say you're a Nike and you have a massive supply chain in all sorts of countries, those companies have to work harder to help their supply chain. And again, in my books, I give several examples of large companies who set up a new capital fund to help their SMEs adapt, right? Because of the value of keeping a robust ecosystem. Because what large companies often say is the drag on my innovation is the inability of my ecosystem to keep up to date with my new demands, right? And a lot of ecosystems are small to medium-sized businesses. So the only answer is either government's going to do it, industry associations are going to do it, partnerships are going to do it, or the big companies are going to see the light in helping everybody do it. And right now it's a combination of those. So I apologize for any question I wasn't able to answer. I probably was too verbose.
All right. Okay. Anyway, this is wonderful when Peter tried to compress his normal one-day program to this only 1.5 hours. So I'm sure that Peter has a lot of problem in compressing all the things, and there's a lot of questions coming in. But anyway, to the audience, thank you very much for joining us today. We started with 189 audiences who came in to join us this morning, Peter, as we explore sustainable pathway towards a greener, more resilient planet. Remember, each step counts, and together we can create positive change. I also like to thank AMRACE and the team because without them, I think the webinar today will not be possible. As well as thank you to Cluster Office for their support for organizing this program. To come. Don't leave camera, the audience, so that we can have a group photo. Okay, siapa yang ambil? Yang ambil. Okay, everybody smile. Wait, the cameraman is not ready yet. Can you say something whether it's ready or not? Okay. Okay. Give a second. All right. Okay. Okay. Okay, wait a few seconds. All right. Okay, smile. Okay. All right. Okay. That's all, guys. Thank you very much for attending, and hope we will see again because I think more coming for us to share our information, knowledge in different platforms. And thank you again, Peter. Hope that you have a good day ahead. Peter is actually having this webinar from Thailand, actually. Thank you very much, Peter, for your time. And also AMRACE team. Thank you very much. Okay, bye. You buat macam semua orang macam mata. Mata. Okay, AMRACE team, thank you very much.
Thank you, thank you, thank you.
Thank you. That was, I think, baru keluar. Baru keluar tangan. Tadi sebenarnya nak klik tangan tu, clap the hand. Tadi cari button. Baru keluar. Alright.
Oh, situ dia.
So So that was really good insight. Yeah.
Ada Astro AWANI.
Ada Astro. Oh, ada.
Ada.
Oh, someone from Astro AWANI pun join.
Yeah, I invited the editor.
Oh, alright. Okay. Thank you very much, AMRACE.
Alright.
So,
Okay, nanti kita sambung balik lah. We'll have a
okay.
first
Nanti,
chat after this.
alright.
Drop Peter an email kot. A thank you email. Alright.
Alright.
Okay.
You do that, is
Alright.
it? I'll do that.
I will.